Hey everybody, welcome back to Race of History. Today we're doing Epic History TV's Alexander the Great Part 2. Let's get into it.
In 334 BC, Alexander, the 21-year-old king of Macedonia, led a coalition of Greek forces against the greatest power of the age, the Persian Empire. He led an army of skilled veterans, at its heart men of the Macedonian phalanx, armed with the 18-foot sarissa pike, and the elite horsemen of his companion cavalry. Together, at the Battle of the River Granicus, they'd won a first decisive victory over the Persian army. Now, as Alexander approached Sardis, capital of the Persian province of Lydia, its commander surrendered without a fight. But before Alexander could advance further, he needed to neutralize Persian naval power. Persia had a powerful fleet with major naval bases around the eastern Mediterranean that could potentially cut his lines of communication back to Greece.
So the Persian Navy is notoriously incredibly strong. However, it's a little bit different than, say, the strength of the Athenian Navy, in that Athens finds a silver mine, decides they're going to build a navy from scratch, and then over time establishes this naval power. Persia conquers Phoenician cities, colonies, trade colonies, and takes over their fleet. And the Phoenicians have the best naval power in the world right now in this time period. And so the Persians go from essentially no naval power to the greatest naval power in this part of the world, maybe the entire world at this time, overnight. I mean, literally overnight. That is a huge advantage for what they want to do militarily. However, the reason that there's kind of a push and pull with that is that Athens doesn't lose control of its navy unless you come and conquer Athens. The Persians can lose control of their navy if you just happen to conquer the Phoenicians. And so you don't actually have to conquer all of Persia in order to strip away their naval power, and that's actually what Alexander does pretty early on in this conflict.
Rather than challenge the Persians at sea, Alexander decided to attack its nearest bases, the Greek coastal cities of Miletus and Halicarnassus. Both put up determined resistance, but were taken by winter. The following spring of 333 BC, Alexander continued his advance into Lycia and Phrygia. At Gordium, he was shown the legendary Gordian Knot. A prophecy said that whoever could unpick it would rule all Asia. Alexander simply took his sword and sliced it in half.
Yep.
Meanwhile, Memnon of Rhodes, a skilled Greek general in Persian service, led Persian warships into the Aegean and captured the islands of Chios and Lesbos. But after Memnon's sudden death from illness, the offensive was abandoned. "18 months had passed since Alexander's army crossed the Hellespont and invaded the Persian Empire. Now Alexander led his men into Cilicia.
Look how far they have traveled on this map. This is an outrageous amount of distance to travel. Here's why that's important. The Persians early on, and I think they talked about this in the first video, they were getting counseled to go full scorched earth. That would have made a huge difference because of how big Persia is. If you burn everything and move further and further and further inland, eventually that army that's following you is going to starve to death. They're going to have to turn around at some point, or they're going to die. The Steppes tribes did this forever against, powers and empires that were way bigger and stronger than these steppe tribes were, but they never would face them in an open battle because they didn't need to. They would just move further and further and further inland, and eventually that big, massive army starts to dwindle further and further and further as their supply lines get strung out further and further. And so had they done that, this might have been a totally different invasion. It almost certainly would have been a totally different invasion. But because the Persian lineage is proud, King Darius III wants a decisive battle against Alexander. He goes for that. He wants that as his main strategy. So he doesn't go scorched earth. He sets up for another battle coming up here. And it could have totally gone differently had he just gone the smarter route.
And was soon poised to cross the Nur Mountains into Syria. But then the main Persian army, led by King Darius III himself, emerged behind the Greek army to the north. Darius was determined to trap and destroy Alexander's army, which he outnumbered almost 2 to 1. So he blocked Alexander's only escape route by moving his army to the coastal plain near Issus, just 6 miles wide, from mountains to sea. The narrow battlefield would force Alexander to fight, but it also prevented Darius exploiting his huge numerical advantage. His army, by some estimates, was up to 100,000 strong, and contained some of the finest soldiers in his vast empire, including 10,000 of his own household troops, known as the Immortals. His best cavalry were massed on his right towards the sea, where the ground was better for horses. His best infantry, his Greek mercenary hoplites, formed the centre. Persian infantry formed his left wing. Alexander deployed his own army for battle, once again entrusting his left wing, nearest the sea, to Parmenion, with the Greek cavalry and infantry. In the centre, as always, was the Macedonian phalanx. Alexander positioned himself and his best troops on the right wing toward the mountain slopes, his elite Agriane javelin throwers, his archers, and behind them the Hypaspists and the companion cavalry. When Alexander saw the strength of the Persian cavalry facing Parmenion on the left, he moved across his Thessalian cavalry to reinforce him. Despite his overwhelming numbers, Darius held his position behind a small river, the Pinarus, and waited for Alexander to attack. He didn't have to wait long. Alexander called out to his men, urging them to fight bravely, picking out some by name. Then, at the head of his army's right wing, he charged. Once again, the speed and shock of the Macedonian advance sent the enemy reeling back. But in the center of the battlefield, the Macedonian phalanx was in trouble. In its effort to keep up with Alexander, its formation had become disordered. Now, in fierce fighting with Darius's Greek mercenaries, the phalanx was slowly being driven back. Alexander, seeing the danger, regrouped and led the companions in a headlong charge straight at the Persian center. The Greek mercenaries threatened on their flank were soon in disarray, and the Macedonian phalanx was able to resume its advance.
This is one of the things I talked about in the last video. but the Greek phalanx is incredibly strong when it's being fought head on. So if it's an army versus an army and they're just going to run or push into each other, the Greek phalanx is one of the strongest, if not the strongest, single military unit of the ancient world. However, it got that strength and gave up maneuverability. And so it had excess strength, had no mobility at all. So if it got attacked on the flanks or in the rear, that army was done. It was finished. It was going to either get surrounded and killed, or it was going to break and run. And, I talked about this also in the other video, but relatively low casualties happen in the actual battles on these ancient battlefields. Whenever the two sides are, running into each other, pushing each other, riding their cavalry into each other, there are relatively low numbers of casualties, which is why when you look at the casualties for Alexander's army through all these battles, they're absurdly low. I mean, the casualties are absurdly low. Now, a lot of historians don't actually believe that casualty count, but most do believe that the count is on the way low side. The reason for that is because if you're not losing battles, then you're never breaking and running. And the breaking and running is when the actual massacre happened. So there's relatively low casualties during the actual battle. Then when one side breaks and runs, that's when the other side's cavalry or whatever can come swoop in, start spearing everybody in the back. And then it's just a field day and the casualties for that side go up astronomically quick. So that's what you're going to see here.
Alexander fought his way towards the great king Darius himself. Rather than face this apparently mad and fearless Macedonian king, Darius fled the battlefield in his royal chariot.
He got the hell out of there. Left his family too.
Meanwhile, the Macedonian left wing under Parmenion was in a desperate fight against the best of the Persian cavalry. If the Persians could break through here, they could envelop Alexander's army and snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. But Parmenion and his troops fought doggedly and continued to hold the Persians at bay. As the news that Darius had fled spread among his troops, they abandoned the fight and tried to save themselves. The battle turned into a massacre. Ptolemy, one of the Macedonian commanders, told Alexander there were so many Persian dead, his men had used them to fill a deep ravine so they could cross over it. The Battle of Issus was a stunning victory for Alexander. And amongst the spoils of victory were Darius's wife, mother, and 3 children, all taken alive and well treated by Alexander. With the Persian field army in retreat, Alexander now turned to subduing the western territories of the Persian Empire. The next year, 332, the coastal cities of Phoenicia submitted to Alexander, ending Persian naval power in the Mediterranean. But the island city of Tyre resisted. Tyre's defenders fought bravely and skillfully, even when Alexander began building a causeway to the island, protected by 2 giant siege towers, which they counterattacked with fire ships. But after 7 months, the city walls were breached and Tyre fell. Most of its citizens were killed or enslaved.
That is something that is often overlooked in ancient warfare. The way that a lot of these wars are financed or continue to be financed is slavery. So whenever you conquer a region, those that you have not killed, you enslave and you sell, and that money that you get for selling the slaves is how you continue to finance the war. Notoriously, Caesar, whenever he goes into Gaul, is in massive, massive debt in Rome. And a lot of historians think that's actually why he was so keen on conquering Gaul, is so that he could basically sell everybody into slavery and get money to cover his debts. That's a huge part of ancient warfare.
Gaza, too, was taken by siege. Alexander continued to Pelusium on the Nile Delta, where the Persian governor of Egypt surrendered the entire province to Alexander, along with the royal treasury. At Memphis, priests of this ancient land welcomed Alexander as their liberator from Persian rule, and crowned him pharaoh. At the mouth of the Nile, he founded a new city, Alexandria, then travelled to the desert oracle of Siwa, where according to some accounts the priests welcomed him as son of Amun, king of the gods. Alexander returned east to Tyre, where in 331 BC he received news of trouble back home. Despite his great victories over the Persians, many Greeks regarded Alexander as a tyrant. King Agis of Sparta, with Persian support, now launched a revolt against Macedonia. Antipater, Alexander's commander in Greece, was already dealing with rebellion in Thrace. But he quickly marched south and met Agis in battle near the city of Megalopolis. Even the legendary Spartans were now no match for Macedonian military power.
Again, I talked about this in the first video, but the Spartans are not the Spartans that we know at this point. Thebes had already totally demolished, kicked their teeth in, kicked them while they were down. They are no longer the military power that they were previous to this during the Greco-Persian Wars. Now, Persia is hoping to basically be able to fund them back onto their feet here, but Sparta has just lost so much of what made them Sparta by this point that they aren't there anymore.
The Spartan army was crushed. King Agis himself was among the fallen. With his base in Greece secure once more, Alexander advanced towards the Persian heartlands, seeking a final showdown with Darius. He received a letter from the Persian king offering him a fortune in gold, his daughter in marriage, and half his empire in exchange for peace. But Alexander's stunning victories, all the oracles and acclamations, had now convinced him that his destiny was to rule the world. He rejected the Persian king's offer. He didn't want half the empire. He was coming to take it all. Research and artwork for this video.
Alright, that was Epic History TV's Alexander the Great Part 2. Like, comment, subscribe, help me keep building the channel over here, and I will see you guys next time.